and welcome to Los Angeles Gallery of Art. I'm at St. Isidore Historical Plaza, which is a very random but very cool historical building that's located off of Katella in Los Alamitos. There's some parking right by, so we're going to work from my car. And as always, I'm using the Etchr Slate Mini, which is the ideal setup for me. I use it sometimes on my tripod. It sits right on my lap in the car. And as you can see, I'm putting my magnets in my water cup. That's how I keep the water off and to the left so I don't knock into it. I learned that the hard way. My palette's on the right side, and the back of the palette, the lid is held up by a clip. The palette keeps only my pure colors. On the left side is my mixing space, which I use a cellulose sponge, which is, I believe, the same kind of sponge that comes with a Stay Wet palette, but I got this gray cellulose sponge off of Amazon. And now I'm just flipping through trying to find a spot. I often have sketch pages ready with masking tape and with a background, but for this one, because it's so bright, it's so airy, and it was really pretty dappled sunlight when I began, I went ahead and decided to use a whole page. As you can see, even when I have this set up on my lap, it's just as compact as when I have it on the tripod, and it stays in place. I will tell you in advance that this video cut off at some point, so you will not see the entire painting, but you'll see a lot of it. I don't paint dappled sunlight very often. This is one of my first attempts. And so you'll see what I'm doing first is putting in the light and shadow patterns around the thing. I'm not putting any kind of base drawing. Gouache is super cool and it's super forgiving. So you can essentially paint right over it if you mess up. It's awesome. I don't even use under drawings that often. With painting with oil, I probably would do a quick under drawing, and that's just the way that I feel about it. You got to do what you feel about it. Do you like doing underpaintings? Do you like taking the time to sketch and lay out where you're going to put your paintings? If you do, then go for it. As you can see, I'm mixing all these shadow colors with the yellow. So there's lots of areas where there's more yellow, there's more shadow. It's very dappled, the sunlight, which is my favorite thing to say. And so there's a lot of areas where that kind of yellow just kind of bounces off. It kind of shows through. There's an area where the tree shadow is not hitting, so that whole center area is lit up. And that's where I am starting. With architecture, it's important that if you have the incorrect, which you can see here, the incorrect types of geometry and perspective, you're going to want to make sure you fix those up. But with gouache, again, it's very easy because you can always grab more gouache and put it right on top. I love gouache for its compact use. I use this Daniel Smith lavender a lot. So that was what you just saw me grabbing, a blue and a lavender. It's in the sky like always. So I end up using it constantly in my paintings, and you'll see that in a lot of these videos. But here I am in the car with my basically my sketchbook and my paint set up on my lap. It's very sturdy. It just sits right there. And I have the window down and I'm just looking out the window, painting away. It's so cool. I'm doing some darker blues around the edges. When I do outdoor paintings with lots of sky, I tend to darken the outside edges to give it a fake vignette, but I'll use whatever colors I see in the sky. So sometimes it's going to be a little bit more purple. Oh, here when we get the days lots of smog, it's a little bit more green and etc. So you'll see that I've added that just so that when I'm done with the painting, it'll look fine. I'm not paying too much attention to perspective yet. You can tell because it doesn't look right. But I'm putting in the shadows in the back wall behind these arches now. So I'm going to go ahead and show those. I've just indicated where the bricks are going to go. There are these cute little bricks in front of these bushes or next to these bushes. And so that's why I wanted to put them in there, just so I could get an idea of how saturated the red was going to be. The idea in general, the major rule that I do follow, which I'm not really a rule follower, I just like to paint, But if I'm going to follow any rules, it's going to be warm light, cool shadow. So what you'll see is those warm areas where I put in the first bits of light. Those were the light areas. It's going to be really warm. It's very yellow. The building itself has a little bit of a yellowness to it. So, and then all the shadows are more blue. They have more purples. They're more desaturated. They're very pretty, kind of like blues. So warm color wheel is going to be your reds, your oranges, your yellows. The cool color wheel is going to be your blues, your teals. You can get into the yellow, but you're going to want to make it towards the blue side. Anything with red in is going to be warm automatically. And that's something to keep in mind when you're doing painting. So you can see my bricks are quite middle value. They don't have a value of their own, really. And later I will warm them up, but I will also cool parts of them down to show the shadows. Okay, now I'm starting to fix the perspective a little bit. So I will take my brush and actually turn it the angle of the perspective I'm trying to grab. So if it's the top of a building, I'll try to angle my brush to be the angle of the top of that building. And here's those cool shadows I was just talking about. These are the cool shadows of the bush areas. The warmth and the yellow comes on the front where the light is hitting those bush areas. And if I use my brush for the perspective, it's nice because I use a big 1-inch flat brush. And it helps me get those straight lines that are going in exactly the angle I want, because that sunlight is going in there at an angle. It's not going in there just straight up. It's got perspective too. This is not a simple painting. But I'm not hardcore about copying perspective or anything, and I'm not too worried about the general idea of the perspective because I can always go back over it. And just cut off at the top, I'm putting in those little, there's this nice, almost brick colored top to this building. This plaza is an old plaza that's like in the middle of, Los Alamitos is kind of a newer, maybe it was built in like the 50s, 60s, that kind of thing. You see some old buildings, but nothing too crazy. And then there's this historical plaza called St. Isidore. It's literally at Katella and Reagan. And the reason I found it is because I go to that post office. That's the closest post office to my house. And so I go over there and I was driving down. I was like, what is that? Look at all those great arches. We have so much history. I will say, after starting to do more plein air painting, I used to be almost exclusively a portrait oil painter. But now that I'm doing more plein air, I'm looking all over Southern California for like places to paint that are essentially with free parking and interesting stuff. And I have found so much, especially historical things that I didn't expect to find. I'm mixing this dark green for this bougainvillea tree, by the way, out of purple. Purple with a little bit of burnt sienna and yellow ochre. I'm not really using green because this is the darker part, and I'm going to have it showing in the back. When you have a big bush, you've got wood, you've got green leaves, then you have the effect of the sky. The darker areas, if we go by our rule of warm light, cool shadows, are going to be cool, so like blues. But inside of there is actually trapped by the leaves. So you'll see some dark reds and purples closer to the interior of the tree, like near the branches and the bark. Also pay attention to the cast shadow from your leaves, as the bark tends to be really, really dark up next to the leaves themselves, and it gets a little bit lighter because there's less cast shadow as you move away from the leaves. So towards the trunk of the tree and the roots of the tree, you're going to see a little bit of lightening up. Okay, I'm putting in the roof here, which is just a little burnt sienna, and I believe a little ivory black. I use way too much ivory black when I'm doing gouache because I find it's the only way to really like decide that that's going to be my darkest spot. However, in oil painting, I never did. This is where our painting cuts off, unfortunately, because my phone overheated. So here is the finished painting. I didn't want to go too far, and you can see it actually became overcast outside. Thank you for joining me on this painting adventure. I hope you learned something new, and happy painting!